They told you it was limited, precision strikes, defensive posture, temporary escalation. But if you zoom out, really zoom out, Operation Epic Fury doesn't look temporary at all. It looks structural. And if this keeps unfolding the way it has over the past few months, it won't just be a Middle East conflict. It will be a financial event, one that lands directly on the balance sheet of the United States. The villain isn't just Iran. It isn't just Washington. It's the collision between geopolitics and debt at a moment when America is already stretched thin. And the victim? Your purchasing power, your investments, the stability of the US dollar itself. And by the time most people recognize what's happening, the damage won't come from bombs. It'll come from bond markets. Now look, before anyone panics, let's ground this in facts. The United States is currently carrying over $34 trillion in national debt. Interest payments have surged due to elevated rates over the last 2 years. In 2025, annual interest costs are approaching, and in some quarters exceeding, core defense spending levels. That's not political spin, that's arithmetic. At the same time, global tensions with Iran have intensified. There have been strikes, retaliatory threats, maritime security operations, cyber warnings, and proxy activity across the region. None of this is theoretical. Insurance premiums on shipping routes have already fluctuated. Energy markets have reacted to even minor incidents in the Strait of Hormuz. And here's why that matters. Roughly 1/5 of the world's oil still moves through that narrow waterway. It doesn't take a full-scale blockade to shock markets. It takes uncertainty, a damaged tanker, a drone incident, a temporary closure. Oil doesn't price in peace, it prices in risk. Even a sustained move above $110 or $120 per barrel would ripple globally. Gasoline rises, shipping costs rise, manufacturing input costs climb, emerging markets wobble, inflation reaccelerates. And here's the trap. The Federal Reserve can't easily cut rates during a geopolitical oil shock without risking inflation credibility. So borrowing costs stay elevated. Mortgage rates remain tight. Credit conditions stay restrictive. Now imagine layering a prolonged regional conflict on top of that. Carrier groups aren't cheap. Missile defense systems aren't cheap. Sustained air operations aren't cheap. Long-term force posture adjustments in the Gulf aren't cheap. Wars in the modern era are financed through debt issuance. And that's where this becomes less about missiles and more about math. The U.S. Treasury already needs to roll over trillions in existing debt annually. Add new defense appropriations and emergency supplemental spending, and issuance increases further. But demand isn't what it used to be. Foreign central banks, including China, have reduced their holdings of U.S. Treasuries compared to prior peaks. Japan's position has fluctuated. Domestic banks are more constrained under post-crisis regulatory frameworks. Pension funds are selective. The Federal Reserve is no longer a net buyer under quantitative tightening. So when supply increases and demand softens, yields rise. Higher yields mean higher interest expenses. Higher interest expenses require more borrowing, and that loop doesn't explode overnight. It tightens slowly. Believe it or not, financial crises rarely begin with sirens. They begin with weak auctions. If Treasury auctions start tailing consistently, meaning investors demand higher yields than expected, confidence shifts. Markets adjust quickly. Equity volatility increases. The dollar reacts. Global capital repositions. Now layer geopolitical escalation into that environment. A direct war between the United States and Iran wouldn't remain bilateral. Iran's regional network includes proxy militias across Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and Yemen. There are asymmetric capabilities. There are cyber tools. There are drone systems. This wouldn't look like 2003. It would look fragmented, distributed, persistent. Energy infrastructure could become a target. Shipping could face intermittent disruption. Insurance markets could harden. Regional allies could be pulled deeper into security arrangements. And here's the difference from previous eras. In 2003, when the U.S. invaded Iraq, the debt-to-GDP ratio was dramatically lower. Interest rates were declining. China was rapidly accumulating treasuries. Globalization was accelerating. Today, debt to GDP is far higher. Rates are structurally elevated compared to the post-2008 era. The geopolitical environment is multipolar. Trust in U.S. fiscal discipline is more contested. The margin for error is thinner. Now, some analysts argue that America can always finance itself because the dollar is the global reserve currency. That's partially true, but reserve status isn't a shield against higher borrowing costs. It simply buys time. If markets perceive prolonged instability, they price risk accordingly. And here's where the June 2026 timeline becomes critical. The U.S. faces ongoing fiscal deadlines, refinancing waves, and election cycle uncertainty over the next 18 months. If conflict spending expands during that window, bond markets won't ignore it. Ratings agencies have already signaled concerns about long-term fiscal trajectories in recent years. Additional structural spending without offsetting revenue will attract scrutiny. Now imagine this scenario. Oil stabilizes at $120 for several quarters. Inflation reaccelerates modestly. The Fed pauses rate cuts or delays them. Treasury issuance increases due to defense outlays. Bond yields rise toward recent highs or beyond. Equity markets, which have been priced for rate relief and AI-driven growth, reprice under tighter liquidity. Suddenly, what started as a regional conflict becomes a domestic financial tightening cycle. And here's the psychological component. Consumer confidence is fragile when gasoline prices spike. Political polarization intensifies when overseas commitments grow. Markets dislike uncertainty. Voters dislike higher costs. If this drags into mid-2026, the fiscal and political calendars collide. That doesn't mean bankruptcy in a literal sense. The United States cannot run out of money in the conventional way, but it can experience fiscal stress. It can face downgraded outlooks. It can see its interest burden crowd out discretionary spending. It can reduce flexibility for future crises. And that's what makes this different from short-term strikes. The danger isn't immediate collapse, it's structural weakening. Now let's talk about oil more concretely. Energy markets today are more diversified than decades ago. U.S. shale production provides buffer capacity. Strategic reserves exist, though they've been tapped in recent years. OPEC decisions remain influential. Demand patterns fluctuate with global growth. But geopolitical risk premiums can persist even without full supply disruption. Insurance underwriters respond quickly. Shipping routes reroute. Futures markets price volatility. Even if barrels keep flowing, perception alone can maintain elevated pricing, and elevated pricing keeps inflation sticky. Sticky inflation limits monetary flexibility. Limited flexibility tightens financial conditions. That's the chain. And while the mainstream focus often shifts between political headlines and cultural debates, the bond market doesn't care about narratives. It cares about supply, demand, and risk. Now consider the defense industrial dimension. Increased procurement supports certain sectors. Defense contractors see backlog growth. Manufacturing benefits in specific regions. But macroeconomically, wartime spending financed through borrowing doesn't create the same productivity multipliers as infrastructure or technology investment. It redistributes resources toward security rather than growth. That matters long term. Another overlooked factor is cyber escalation. Iran has demonstrated cyber capabilities in prior incidents. U.S. infrastructure is heavily digitized. Financial networks are resilient but not invulnerable. A sustained cyber campaign wouldn't destroy the system, but it could amplify volatility. Markets react sharply to uncertainty in payment systems or energy grids. Again, not apocalyptic, just destabilizing. And markets don't need apocalypse. They need discomfort. Let's step back for a moment. The U.S. economy remains large, innovative, and structurally powerful. GDP growth has surprised to the upside in recent quarters. Labor markets, while cooling, have not collapsed. Corporate earnings in key sectors remain solid. This is not a weak state on the verge of implosion, but it is a leveraged state operating in a higher rate world. That distinction is everything. When leverage meets volatility, fragility increases. So what would signal that this is becoming a genuine financial threat rather than a contained geopolitical episode? Watch three things. First, sustained oil above $115–120 without rapid reversal. Second, consecutive weak Treasury auctions with rising bid-to-cover stress and widening tails. Third, public acknowledgement from fiscal authorities that supplemental defense spending will require expanded issuance without offsets. If those three align, the risk shifts from manageable to structural. And if they align before mid-2026, the political pressure compounds. Now here's what most people misunderstand. Great powers rarely collapse from military defeat alone. They erode from fiscal overextension layered onto geopolitical ambition. History shows it repeatedly. Empires stretch supply lines, finance conflicts through debt, and underestimate duration. Duration is the killer variable. If Operation Epic Fury remains limited, contained, and short-lived, the system absorbs it. If it evolves into a multi-theater, multi-year commitment in a high-rate environment, absorption becomes strain, and strain reshapes markets. You won't see it first in dramatic speeches. You'll see it in yield curves, in currency charts, in insurance premiums, in defense supplemental bills. It will look technical, boring even, until it isn't. Because when borrowing costs rise while obligations expand, something adjusts. Spending gets cut elsewhere, taxes become politically debated, entitlement reform conversations resurface, market volatility increases, and the average household feels it through higher living costs and tighter credit. That's the nightmare scenario, not invasion, not collapse, but compounding financial pressure at a time when flexibility is already constrained. Now, none of this is inevitable. Diplomatic channels remain open. Back-channel negotiations occur constantly in geopolitics. Energy markets adapt. Fiscal frameworks can adjust. Growth can offset stress. But ignoring the financial dimension of military escalation would be naive. And pretending that debt doesn't matter because the U.S. can always print misunderstands inflation dynamics in a globalized system. Printing into an oil shock isn't neutral. It's destabilizing. So as headlines focus on immediate strikes and retaliation, the deeper question isn't who controls which airspace. It's whether America can afford prolonged instability at current interest levels. If you want to stay ahead of this, the link in the description has more. Otherwise, keep a close eye on oil benchmarks, Treasury auction data, Federal Reserve messaging, and any deployment described as temporary that quietly extends past its deadline. Because sometimes the real battlefield isn't overseas, it's the bond market, and that's a war no one can afford to lose.